If wilderness is the most unmappable territory, the last British wilderness vanished in the mid-19th century with the first standardized mapping of the British Isles. The Ordnance Survey, began as a military undertaking, represents the complete objectification of the English landscape. The survey fabricates a relationship to land, one that operates using what feminist scholar Donna Haraway terms the God trick, the omniscient and objective gaze wearing a mask of neutrality. In its curated, static frame, land is rendered resource and commodity, something to be bought, measured, and used. The God trick map is a tool of conquest, an instrument of empire. In the past few decades, it has transformed into a ubiquitous navigational model, a way by which we orient ourselves in the world. But the map is not objective. The map is fiction. What stories do our maps tell? The English landscape is made up of lines, boundaries enforced historically by negotiation and recollection, and currently by legislation based on the survey. The cartographic line is arbitrary, yet it designates land as worthy or unworthy of saving from ecological harm. The line signifies power. Conservation boundaries are one particular type of boundary line, one that aims to preserve and protect. This is the line demarcating Britain's first national park, the Peak District. This region was designated in 1951 after decades of working-class-led activism called for recreational access to the privatised countryside. Romantic-era landscape paintings of Derbyshire, such as this one by George Smith, gave the illusion of far-reaching, lush landscapes, masking the reality of enclosure and privatisation. The English National Park, then, is an attempt to restore access without the commons, where conservation becomes an authoritative blanket over a privately owned landscape. Much of the land is owned by water companies, charitable bodies like the National Trust, grouse hunting estates, and private landholders. Under the private property regime, access to land is fraught territory, leading to ongoing right-to-roam activism. Moorland landscapes are scarred by grouse hunting, where heather burning marks are made visible in the satellite view. This is detrimental to the rich peat soil covering much of the region that acts as a carbon sink. The perception of moorland as wilderness goes back centuries. Daniel Defoe called them the most desolate, wild, and abandoned country. Long portrayed as empty wastelands, the moors in fact have rich histories of inhabitation and ecological transformation. Human traces date back millennia, where scattered marks on the OS map indicate lost rituals and lifeways, in stone circles, burrows, cairns, and tumuli. These were old modes of wayfinding, predating the map's all-knowing view. Preservation and management of the Peak District is embedded in Romantic-era landscape imaginaries of the pastoral and the sublime, created in large part due to paintings like this one by Joseph Wright. Ideas of wilderness as pristine, untouched nature continue to inform conservation efforts such as rewilding. Yet as thinkers such as William Cronin have exposed, wilderness is an impossible geography, an imaginary fabricated in large part by visual cultures, and one that forces a troubling distance between humans and nature. Rejecting the concept of wilderness, let us instead imagine convivial wildness, where convivial at its root means to live together, and wildness signifies the interdependence of human and other-than-human worlds. Imagine this. Visitors to the Peak District become transient commoners in the process of reclaiming private land and practicing ways of being collectively with each other and with the more-than-human realm, making space for alterity while recognizing entanglements with one another. For these relational shifts to be possible, the conventional map and its neutralizing imaginary must also be questioned. New protocols of situated engagement require new forms of mapping. What happens when a drawing's line weight meets landscape? By projecting the Ordnance Survey onto a wall in the Architectural Association School of Architecture, the Peak District is reconstructed within the studio space. Zooming into the map, boundaries appear and disappear as they pass through fields of legibility. The projected map meets the fuzzy charcoal line, mirroring the abstracted way in which a map constructs landscape. In drawing across time and scale, I build a new map, one that challenges the resolution of a boundary that the God trick survey seeks to maintain. This durational map, mediated by the eyes of the projector and the camera, exposes the false precision presented by the static survey. As the map's lines widen, The boundary that marks publicly accessible land is revealed as a thick margin measuring 28 meters, blurring the binary conditions of private and public, trespass and right to roam. This ambiguous margin becomes a projective space. Let's enter into it. Dry stone walls stitched across the landscape inhabit the map's blurry margins. They demarcate property and enclosures, but they have lives of their own. They are porous, crumbling, wet, and encrusted with lichens. Stone structures dotting the landscape reflect a constant process of reshuffling the terrain, an exchange between surface and subsurface. Some endure for thousands of years, while others appear and disappear within days. This is where geologic, human, and plant timescales converge. Boundaries have long been negotiated in the moorland landscape, where markers and elements like stoops, dikes, and prominent rocks became wayfinding devices. Beating the bounds, or perambulations, were yearly processions where collective walking became a way of mapping the land. When visiting the moorlands, I begin to imagine maps everywhere. I make them by walking, mapping the ground at the pace of my footsteps. I make them by hammering rocks with a paper held between them. I make them by rubbing stone walls with charcoal, feeling their ridges through paper. I make them by stacking stones from broken walls into cairns, attuning myself to their collaboration with gravity. In the studio, I build a cairn in charcoal, drawing at the scale of my body. When I draw the wall into a shelter, hollowing the aggregation into an inhabitable space, the drawing becomes a propositional site. In the field, I build a cairn and trace all 100 stones before I stack them, making a template of my immediate geologic surroundings. Caught in the transition between broken wall and aggregation, the tracings become a selective blueprint to the specific place in the moors. In creating a dialectic between temporal one-to-one maps made in studio and in the field, projective spaces emerge in which to speculate landscape futures. I intervene in the process of projection, using the moving camera in the field and the projector in the studio as technical oculi that reconstruct landscape as a propositional space. Commoning requires collective action. I begin to expand my cartographic methods to include plural voices. We make maps by walking together. We make maps by building dry stone together. We make maps by drawing the projective landscape together, imagining moorland futures. The process of commoning begins with trespass as the direct reclamation of land. The act of temporarily inhabiting and building in the landscape becomes transgressive. As transient commoners navigate by stone rather than the Ordnance Survey, access boundaries are rendered illegible. Moorland commoners collectively build field stations where they stay for several weeks or months at a time, taking part in forms of living conservation that embraces the landscape in flux, such as mossing, wetting, and diversifying the peatland. The field stations begin to appropriate existing stone structures, supported by timber scaffolds from local conifer plantations, that appear and disappear alongside the construction and maintenance of the dry stone. A grouse shooting butt is turned into a cairn, sabotaging its utility for hunting. A cairn becomes a hollow shell, turning a marker into a refuge. A dry stone wall marking enclosures opens into an inhabitable space. Design becomes a process of sorting, shifting, and assembling found stones. They are one-ingredient structures whose forms are guided by the shapes of the stones themselves. Together, the field stations form a wayfinding constellation, marking axes of convivial rewilding. I draw a field station at a scale of 1-to-1 in the studio, where the time-lapse registers an accelerated frequency of my body's movement, decentering the human timescale. Cutting through the rock and section reveals its porosity, less of a dividing barrier than a host for many forms of life. The stones are scaffolds inviting more than human inhabitation. Over time, moss, lichens, insects, birds, and mammals begin to dwell and take shelter in their nooks and crevices, thriving in geologic porosity. The field stations are maintained by transient commoners, requiring continual care and repair as they crumble. The Ordnance Survey's legend is a technical annotation projected onto the land. As dry stone field stations are assembled and rearranged, the rocks themselves become a legend to the transient commoners. To read the rock map is an exercise in deep listening and observation, a practice in becoming attuned to the rhythms of more than human worlds. The rocks become geocultural archives, recording the striation of deep time and the decomposition of life into mineral, holding marks inscribed by the transient commoners to communicate with those yet to come. To participate in commoning is to recognize your obligations to the land and the entangled life it holds, to offer more than you take, to belong to the land rather than to own it, to show through collective occupation the illusion of land deemed empty and inhospitable. As field stations are built and unbuilt, they stitch through the landscape, making legible the land as an archive of relentless transformation. As convivial wildness reclaims the moorlands, the God-trick map dissolves in its inability to register the unknowable.